I think I met most of you. My name is Andrew Chen, and I'm here today to talk about my CDS research paper, which was titled Connected Fitness in a Post-COVID World. So we'll start quickly with the agenda. First, we're going to define the connected fitness industry. I'll provide some background on the connected fitness industry with regards to what's happened in the last 3 to 4 years. Then we'll introduce the research paper and talk about the 2 main aspects of it, which was lessons learned and recommendations around connected fitness, and then just end with my final thoughts. Any questions before we get started? Cool. So let's start with defining the connected fitness industry. So within the context of this research paper, I defined the connected fitness industry as businesses that provide technology-enabled hardware products that consumers use primarily for at-home exercise. So here's 4 good examples. Peloton's probably the most well-known one. Tonal is a little less well-known. It's a strength machine that you attach to the wall. Hydro is essentially Peloton except for rowers. And then Mirror is a TV that provides a reflection and a video for a workout. Out of scope for this paper was health and fitness wearables, digital only / content only fitness products, and also traditional in-person gyms. Cool. So now we'll get into a little bit of the background around connected fitness and kind of what's happened in the last 3 to 4 years. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, the connected fitness industry experienced exponential growth. Peloton, again, most famous example, sales went up by 200%. And we also see their market cap go from $8 billion to nearly $50 billion. Other players also capitalized on this. Tonal raised $110 million at nearly a $2 billion valuation. And Tempo also raised $220 million. Hydro is doing so well that they were in talks to go public via SPAC. And then Lululemon also won in on the action and bought Mirror for $500 million. People also expected continued growth in this connected fitness category. Folks were talking about how people were going to work out at home forever and how the gym was essentially dead. Turns out they were very, very wrong. Again, super easy to pick on Peloton here, most famous example, but right now I think their stock's down more than 90%. I think it's like 95, 96%. Went through 4 rounds of layoffs. Hydro laid off 35% of their company and then also scrapped the whole IPO plan. Tonal recently, I think it was 2 weeks ago, raised $130 million at a $500 million valuation, which is 25% of their previous market cap. And then Lululemon is very much regretting the acquisition of Mirror. Their earnings report came out a couple weeks ago. They posted a $440 million post-tax impairment charge on the $500 million acquisition. So now we'll get into my research paper. So we provide the context and sort of the background of what happened in terms of the boom and bust, and then we've also provided the scope in terms of how I defined the connected fitness industry. But now we'll focus on this part, which was the goal of my paper. So it's really to answer 2 questions. 1, what lessons can be learned from the mistakes connected fitness companies made in the last 3 years? And then 2, how should connected fitness companies adjust their business models and strategies to survive and grow in a post-COVID world? So let's jump into the first piece, which is the lessons learned. First lesson is old habits die hard. I think a big takeaway is that in general, people don't change their habits unless they're forced to, which is kind of what we saw in connected fitness. Folks didn't choose at-home fitness over the gym, they were forced to, and then when gyms reopened, we saw a massive rebound. So I know it's kind of small on this chart here, but at the very far right bar graph, this compares June 2022 gym visits relative to June 2019, and we see they're up nearly 30%. Additionally, I think connected fitness companies in general just underplayed how important the gym is for a lot of people in terms of their habits. And I think that's kind of covered by this McKinsey quote. 70% of fitness consumers report missing the gym as much as they miss family and friends during the pandemic. Second lesson learned, hardware is just hard. There's a reason why VCs love SaaS businesses. They have low fixed costs, super easy to scale, and predictable recurring revenue. None of those things are really true with hardware. And I think a big problem with hardware can be sort of summarized with this quote from a conversation I had with the former COO of Zwift. He said, everyone says it, but the bullet effect is real. You don't have all the information, have to make guesses, and the effects of those guesses get amplified all throughout the supply chain. The bullet effect essentially is shown in this little image down here. It's basically where smaller changes in consumer demand gets amplified throughout the entire supply chain, and then folks make bad decisions, which is exactly what we saw with Peloton, again, to pick on them. They ended up buying a fitness manufacturing company or a hardware manufacturing company called Precor for nearly $500 million, and then opened up a new manufacturing facility that they're now trying to sell. Third piece is dynamic TAMs require dynamic responses. When your TAM is volatile, you have to be careful of high fixed costs and also CapEx. I think a volatile TAM is pretty easy to describe connected fitness. In the beginning or pre-COVID, we saw a small, pretty niche population. Then COVID hit, general public kind of becomes into play in terms of the TAM, and then post-COVID, we're seeing that it's going back to affluent niche consumer. When your TAM's super volatile like that, it's really hard, or you shouldn't, in my opinion, make these decisions that are binary as opposed to ones that you can sort of dial up and dial down. So for example, a factory, that's pretty binary. You can't reduce the scale of that. And then same thing with something that Tonal did with regards to super expensive partnerships. They partnered with LeBron, Serena, I think Steph Curry, right? And these are very expensive acquisitions, or I'm sorry, not acquisitions, expensive sponsorships that, again, when demand and TAM reduces, you can't kind of scale that back. It's binary. So let's move into some recommendations I have for the future of connected fitness. First is invest in hybrid. So let's define hybrid fitness, which is an integrated mix of virtual, in-person, and at-home health and wellness offerings to support consumers no matter where they choose to work out. Essentially, people want diversity in terms of how they work out, which we can see through this graph here, where folks are working out, some at home, outside, at the gym, and also in studio/classes. To be frank, I don't know necessarily what this solution looks like, but I think some of the moves Peloton's making in terms of investing heavily in its mobile app to meet the consumers where they are is a good one, and that these other connected fitness companies need to do the same. Second piece is enhance the subscription. Just across the board, subscription fatigue is real, and consumers need continuous value to justify the cost. These subscriptions aren't cheap. Tonal, Peloton, all these ones are like $50, $60 a month. It's not like $7 or $8. So folks really need to see the value outside of just additional classes, in my opinion. I think Lululemon was doing something pretty cool with regards to providing a lot more value with their subscription. They were providing 10% off of apparel, discounts to partner studios for in-person gyms, and then also some social aspects in terms of meetups at different Lululemon stores to go on community runs. And I think that other connected fitness players need to do something very similar. And then last piece is I think connected fitness players need to leverage brick and mortar partners more so. Right now, the main way they're doing it is through retail partners. So Tonal's in Nordstrom, Hydra's in Best Buy, and there's a handful of others that are escaping my mind right now. I think a lot more needs to be done. I think a good step is Peloton going in every single Hilton branded hotel, just from an awareness perspective. But I think there can be some pretty clever things they can do with regards to folks returning to work. I think across the board, we're seeing that remote work is still big, but it's not what it was 1 or 2 years ago, and that's kind of trending upwards. So I think there's interesting partnerships with WeWorks, apartment complexes, stuff like that. Last thing is just my final thoughts on sort of all of connected fitness and just general fitness tech in general. So first, just very bearish on the connected fitness industry as a whole. I think it's too competitive, too niche, and too expensive. I think there is some potential for consolidation. And if you had asked me a year or two ago, I think big tech would have been an option. But right now, we're seeing big tech is kind of shedding those less profitable projects or ones that are in their core business. For example, Amazon just got rid of their Amazon Halo device, which is one of their wearables that competed with Fitbit. I am bullish on traditional gyms. I like this quote from a conversation I had with a Peloton SVP. He said, people go to gyms besides to work out, to look at people, to get out of their house, and to get away from their wives. I just think across the board that gyms provide a lot of value outside of workouts, and that's not changing, especially as consumers have more wellness-focused lifestyles. Also, some different gyms are doing some pretty cool stuff around framing their service as an athletic country club or a wellness center. Lifetime Fitness has done this really well in terms of adding in a bunch of pickleball courts, having spas, having meals delivered. So I think that's something that we'll see continue. And the last thing, I'm bullish on sports/exercise agnostic products. I think one thing, digital one-on-one coaching, so apps like Future, can really capitalize on different trends that are going on in fitness and not be really tied to just biking or cycling or applies, wherever the hot thing is. And same thing with Strava, right? Strava has tons of integrations and the social media component that can be really useful regardless of the medium that people choose to work out. And that's it. Q&A.
One question that comes up is, given we've had a number of really high-profile software businesses in this space for a while, you mentioned Strava and others, do you did you get a sense from some of the folks you talked to why they felt like hardware was the solution they wanted in the first place?
Yeah.
Because it seems to me there's also potentially a challenge just by going down that road to begin with.
Yeah, I think hardware was important in the beginning, or at least, again, just kind of using Peloton's example, it provides a much better, more immersive experience. So there's like that piece as well, right? I know like in the beginning, Peloton talked about how they thought about letting folks like use their own screens and not having a screen. And then they chose to not do that, right? So I think the overall immersive experience is the reason why hardware. But I think we're seeing across the board that it's just really, really hard from a unit economics perspective. I mean, Zwift got into the hardware space, got out, got back in. It's just really, really hard. So I think across the board, hardware makes it just incredibly difficult to monetize and to be profitable in any reasonable length of time.
Other questions? If you had to pick one kind of area for these companies to prioritize right now, what would it be?
Hybrid. I really think hybrid. Across the board, I think when I was talking to the Peloton SVP, he was chatting a little bit with me about how they're thinking through how to sort of take the one-on-one coaching approach and scale that for folks to use their app at gyms, when they're outside on run. They're sort of doing that right now with some of their audio guided workouts. But I think that can be really impactful across the board.
Do you think there's an opportunity for these connected fitness, mostly sort of some of these ones that aren't successful to partner with actual gyms, and would that create conflict for the actual gyms, or do you see an opportunity for collaboration?
I thought about that a little bit. I don't see a great opportunity because a lot of these, like the point of these progs is that it's like a one size fits all type of thing. So like I'm just imagining a tonal being put in an alumni gym, right? Having someone work out there for like an hour by themselves, that's just challenging from like a throughput perspective. So I don't see that. I think where that could work is in the office space, right? If you have like a small office or a WeWork, you can have like 8 or 10 tonals and a couple Pelotons. I think that could be really like a space effective way to have people work out. But from like a large gym perspective, I don't think it really makes sense.
Does it mainly change your model from C to B to C to B to B?
I think that's like one area for growth. Like I honestly across the board like just don't think that that's enough, right? These companies are really, really struggling, but I think that is something that they should explore.
Is there any lessons that you can take from this space and generalize this outside of this space to other industries or?
Yeah. Let's go back to. Yeah, I mean, across the board, I think I think the habits piece, I would say. I think during COVID, we saw lots of different technologies come into play, right? Especially for at-home work. And I think those are a little stickier, kind of based off of how folks are still working from home a lot more than they did prior. But just the habits piece is just people don't, like in general, people don't want to change their habits. Like people are creatures of habit. They like to do the same thing over and over again, and it's really hard to convince them to change. And I think that's something that folks need to remember across the board. And then also just I think the like long, like the binary investments where it's you're taking big risks. I think that isn't the best idea. Obviously, it's easy for me to say this in retrospect, right? Had at-home fitness continued forever, then it would have made sense to build your own factory and buy this manufacturing company. But that turned out to be wrong, right? And because of that, they had these massive fixed costs that became hugely problematic. So having ones that you can sort of just slowly turn the knob on and turn off, I think, would be better.
But why do you think that they turn to these big fixed costs rather than having more dynamic upfront?
I imagine that was just bad forecasting, if I had to guess, right? You think that you're going to need a ton of manufacturing capacity, cheaper to build it in-house in the long run, probably, from like a unit economics perspective. then licensing that out to someone, which is what Peloton's doing right now. That's what they decided to do. So that's what I imagine it is, like the long-term cost savings. But if you don't reach scale, then obviously that becomes a problem.
Your third one around TAM is really interesting to me because, when startups, regardless of sector, are raising capital, they talk about TAMs in a way that to me has always been relatively unrealistic. Like, is that something you think, is really great for raising money, but not really great for running a business? And how do you kind of, how do these companies come to terms with that duality of
Yeah, I think so. I talked to a couple folks in venture as well, especially the CEO of Zwift, and he talked a lot about how he thinks that venture was a reason for all of this. Like Zwift, I think during COVID got like a $400 million investment from some big VC or private, I can't remember, VC or private equity shop, and then they were wanting them to spend the money, right? And I think that leads to somewhat perverse incentives. And I have no clue how to fix that. That's something way beyond my knowledge. But I do think that the VCs had a lot of problems, or caused a lot of these problems as well by giving these capital, having pretty unrealistic growth expectations, and then making Tonal spend however million dollars on LeBron and Serena, which ended up not really working.
On the hardware piece itself, are you seeing people thinking about different form factors, much more low cost, maybe a complement to the gym at home? I think that's one possibility. And then second, maybe looking from other tech, using the hardware as a platform for fitness more broadly, right? Something that you can give access to content creators to, and so on and so forth. Are those two types of thinking, that it doesn't have to be a Peloton that's a gym in your house, but a complement to your usual gym kind of routine, and then the other one being it's a platform device for fitness content in general, or selling other content in general?
Yeah, so I think talking about your second piece, the platform, I'm not seeing that with hardware. I see it a lot with digital apps. There's a lot of apps that kind of provide these different content, like these fitness influencers on the platform. But I'm not really seeing that a ton with hardware. With regards to the first question, remind me again what it was? Oh, sure. Yeah, they're trying, and I think they come out super gimmicky, right? Peloton came out with like this really crappy webcam that just did not take off. Tempo did something similar. Tempo has, I don't think I have a picture of Tempo, but it's like a pretty bulky product, and they came out with like a smaller version. They just come out really gimmicky, and I think like reminiscent of like stuff you saw, like I don't know, like I think of like that thigh thingy that folks would like use in like the 80s, right? Like it just doesn't really work. So that's my take on it, at least.
You had said that you were enthusiastic about more hybrid approaches. I remember that before the pandemic, Peloton had like I think 1 or 2 studios in New York that were in person, and the experience was a little bit more like a SoulCycle or like a traditional spin class. Why do you think that they haven't like jumped back into that space post-pandemic?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I think they do, right? Like I don't know if you've taken a Peloton class recently, but they have like folks back in. I don't know how it works in terms of like if you have to pay or if you're like chosen. But I have seen like now the Peloton workouts do have like folks in the background, as opposed to during COVID they didn't. I mean, when you're thinking about it, I imagine just like the CapEx or maybe CapEx is the wrong term, but like the rent for the studios, like hiring these trainers, I think then you're competing in a space that's just like not your core competency. You were then directly competing with boutique cycling studios. And I think a big draw to Peloton is the talent. And the talent can't really scale, I feel like, right? Like if you have, Ali Love like pop in once a week or at a studio in New York, like maybe that's kind of cool, but like how do you scale that across the rest of the country? So I think that piece makes it so it doesn't make a ton of sense.
Going the other way, is there something about this particular industry? It seems like you brought up you know, the high master from the 80s,
Yeah.
and you think about CrossFit, and you think about like, is there something to this space also that makes it particularly challenging because of the waves of fad?
I co- 100%, and that's why I talked about why I'm bullish on digital one-on-one coaching and Strava's, because it kind of it will be fine with different fads, right? And I completely agree. I think that like cycling became a big fad, and then we said go away. Now like Pilates, like all these connected fitness Pilates products are coming out and gaining some traction. And again, I think it's the same thing. Like, yeah, it's kind of cool, but it's a fad, and that's why I think one-on-one coaching, products like Strava, will like kind of stand the test of time.
I'm curious how, if in your conversations you spoke to anyone in terms of the data that these devices gather, and whether, like, what the companies are trying to do in terms of their approach between maybe seeing that as a potential monetization stream, but also being very wary in terms of privacy and not wanting for consumers to be spooked, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a conversation you had. I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so I think that conversation is a lot more interesting when you get into like the health wearable space. But for connected fitness, or at least how I defined it with like the hardware piece, I think it's like less interesting. Because with the Peloton, you might see like what classes they took and whatnot, but from like a healthcare perspective or anything, that wouldn't be super helpful, I don't think. And same thing with like tonal stuff. I imagine the data you want is heart rate, respiratory rate, all these other things, and that's the stuff you're not really getting with connected fitness, how I defined it.
Sorry. I was curious to hear if you saw that most of these products get sold, or I guess shipped to people who would be normally within the area of a gym anyway? Or if like, because I'm thinking maybe part of their, maybe like a potential avenue to success would be if they focus like their marketing efforts on more rural areas where like people really didn't have access to a gym.
That's
And so they
interesting.
might have like.
Yeah. So I will say that right now that's definitely not the case. They're not focused on rural areas because like if you try to, or if you look at a Peloton commercial, at the end it says like very specific in terms of like where they deliver. They will only deliver to like major cities and stuff because you have to get technicians out there to like install it, and tonal is even more burdensome. You have to like drill into your wall, which is obviously like a huge pain in the butt and stuff. So they are not focused on rural areas. That's an interesting idea, one I haven't thought of before. But I just don't know if that like, as like looking at how these places are, or I'm sorry, these companies are branded, like I just don't think that it would appeal to like some farmer in Wyoming or something like that. Yeah, I mean that's fair, but they're all brand. I mean, like just look at like who's like these pictures, right? Like that appeals to a very specific, affluent type of consumer. So they have to like completely reframe their marketing if they wanted to like go after that space. And then again, like those people are probably less focused on wellness. So there's like, is it worth the ROI? Cool. Thanks, guys.